Egypt continues its slow march towards democracy. The coup is less than a week old, and the military says that it wants to hand over power to a government and an elected president within 6 months. Meanwhile, anti-Mubarak protests have been replaced with labor strikes. The military is urging everyone to get back to work so the country can tackle its economic and social problems. Egypt's foreign minister is calling for international aid to help repair the economic damage created by the days of protests that ousted President Mubarak. Gordon Robison spent years in the Middle East as a journalist. Today, he writes for the Gulf News. It is the largest English newspaper in the region. Gordon, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure to be back.
Before we get into some of the, machinations of the coup and such, one of the stories that came out today is CBS News correspondent Laura Logan suffered a brutal sexual assault that night that Mubarak was stepped down, and she was covering the events in Tahrir Square. And it just kind of talks about the dangers that journalists have been in, not only in the Middle East, but covering this event. Earlier in the weeks leading up to it, journalists were targeted as well. Western journalists were. It's just a really volatile situation.
Yes, and it was clearly a very dangerous assignment. I don't know Laura Logan, but other friends of mine who have been working in Egypt over the last couple of weeks have told me how incredibly difficult and incredibly volatile the situation could be. Even last Friday, which was mostly a day of jubilation, it was possible in a mob that size for bad things to happen, which clearly was the case.
But we were talking about this off camera. It didn't seem like this, in the week leading up to it, there were more instances where journalists and Western journalists were specifically being targeted, which is kind of unusual in the grand scheme of things in journalists covering events in the Middle East.
That's correct. It is unusual for Western journalists to be specifically targeted as Western journalists, but about a week before Mubarak stepped down, we were seeing exactly that, and that was something that the regime stirred up consciously in an attempt to try to prevent there being very much coverage of what was happening. The state radio and television essentially spread lies, saying that Western journalists were all Iranian or Israeli spies, and I realize that seems kind of contradictory. But you have to bear in mind that Egypt is a very large country, that somewhere between a quarter and a third of Egyptians are illiterate, and that large number of illiterate people get much of their information from state broadcasting. So it was fairly easy for state TV to whip up a lot of animosity directed at the foreign press.
And when they were trying to hold on to their power as much as possible.
Correct.
Looking ahead now, the military was kind of in charge before, even though Mubarak and his government was at the head of the table. But they are in charge now, but they say they want to hand things over. What are you seeing, or what are you seeing, or people that you know seeing, as far as constitutional progress and things going on in Egypt now?
Well, the military rulers of Egypt have announced that they have appointed a committee headed by a very respected retired judge to look at changes to the Constitution, that these changes will be announced in 10 days' time. Now, if that seems like a really short time frame for rewriting the Constitution, bear in mind that what they're talking about is rewriting specific clauses of the Constitution, which sort of everybody agrees were things that were put into the Constitution by Mubarak, mostly in the last 5 to 10 years, to guarantee his own rule. So the committee is going to be looking at a set of specific changes. Those will be announced in 10 days, the military says, and then will be put to a public referendum in 2 months. Then a couple of months after that, there will be parliamentary elections. If all of that goes ahead according to that timetable, and depending obviously on what this committee comes back with in terms of changes to the Constitution, all of those are fairly good signs. The other thing to keep an eye, so the things to keep an eye on in the immediate future are what these constitutional changes look like when they're proposed in about 10 days. And second, when will the military move to lift emergency law, which has been in effect in Egypt more or less continuously since 1967. And emergency law has emerged as, for the protesters, a symbol that's almost as important as Mubarak himself was.
So as soon as that changes, that's when we can see real change, or the possibility for real change.
I would say that if the military does not lift emergency law within a week or so, that we will probably see protesters come back into the street, because they'll see that as a sign that the military is not operating in good faith.
And we're running out of time here, but obviously we're seeing these changes happening in Egypt, and they're spilling over to the rest of the Middle Eastern area, specifically in Iran. You know, thousands of protesters have come out in the past few days. How much potential do you see for the kind of grassroots change or grassroots struggle that has started in Egypt spreading to these other countries?
Well, it's going to vary a lot from country to country. In the case of Iran, for example, the Iranian government proved in 2009 that it is prepared to deal with protesters in very, very brutal ways. The place that in the next few days, in the next week, we as Americans really ought to be paying attention to is Bahrain. Bahrain is a tiny, tiny country. It's a very small island in the Persian Gulf just off the coast of Saudi Arabia. But why we as Americans should care about that is Bahrain is also the home port for the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet and is in fact the largest U.S. military installation outside the United States. So if Bahrain goes up in flames, that could be a big problem for us both strategically and simply because there are an awful lot of Americans in a very tiny country.
Yeah, it seems like things are happening so rapidly, and it seems like a major challenge is to keep in track of what's happening on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely.
Gordon Robison, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
All right, coming up next, Vermont sues the NRC. That is next in Today's Talk.